The city of Kettlebrook was quiet that evening, as if even the cobblestone streets of the quaint village knew something dark was about to unfold. The air was crisp, with a chill that hinted at the arrival of fall. But the usual peace of the town was shattered by an event that would soon ripple through the fabric of its community. It was the murder of Bishop Clarence Westbrook, a man whose influence had extended beyond the boundaries of his church and into the very heart of the village. Father Gilbert Brown, known to his congregation as simply Father Brown, was the first to hear the news. He had just finished his evening prayers in the small, serene church that he had tended to for so many years. His eyes were still heavy with the sacred words when the bell at the entrance rang unexpectedly, pulling him back into the present. The door creaked open, and Sergeant Thomas Riley entered, his face grim, his uniform still showing signs of the cold, damp night. The weight of his expression made Father Brown instinctively brace himself. "Father Brown," Riley began, his voice low and steady, "I'm afraid we need your help." Father Brown, though never one to seek out trouble, had long known that he had a particular gift for seeing the truth in things that others might overlook. His keen sense of observation and empathy made him invaluable in situations of crime or confusion. The recent crimes in Kettlebrook had been few, but he knew when the darkness that occasionally swept through the town arrived, it would need his particular brand of insight. He stood and gestured for Riley to continue. "It's Bishop Westbrook," Riley said quietly. "He's been found dead in his study. There are questions. I believe you'll want to see it for yourself." Father Brown nodded without hesitation, already sensing the seriousness of the situation. There was a particular way the police officer spoke that conveyed more than the words alone could. Riley's sense of duty was strong, but there was also something deeply unsettling in his voice. Father Brown had been in Kettlebrook long enough to know that Riley didn't easily get rattled. The two of them made their way through the dim-lit streets, the quiet of the town now broken by the hurried footfalls on the wet pavement. As they reached the bishop's residence, the imposing stone structure loomed large against the misty backdrop. The mansion was isolated, standing at the top of a steep hill, surrounded by trees whose twisted branches seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers in the fog. They were greeted by the local constable, Harold Perkins, who stood outside the heavy, wooden doors. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly, though he tried to appear composed. It wasn't lost on Father Brown that Perkins had been a relatively new officer, still trying to prove his mettle to the older constables. "Father," Perkins began, his voice tight, "we found him. In his study, just like Sergeant Riley said. But it doesn't make sense. We've called for a doctor, but..." Father Brown cut him off gently. "Show me." They entered the house, the smell of incense still heavy in the air. The grand staircase creaked underfoot as they ascended, making their way to the second floor where the bishop's private study was located. The large oak doors stood ajar, and Father Brown could immediately sense something was off. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the heaviness of tragedy. Inside, the study was lavish, filled with expensive leather-bound books, a large, mahogany desk cluttered with papers, and a grand window that looked out over the town. But it wasn't the rich decor that caught Father Brown's attention. It was the sight of Bishop Westbrook himself. The bishop lay slumped in his high-backed chair, his eyes staring blankly at the ornate fireplace across from him. His robes, once pristine, were now marred by a dark stain spreading from his chest, a stain that had soaked into the fine fabric of his ceremonial garments. His hands were clenched tightly around a small object, and as Father Brown approached, he could see it was a golden cross, the symbol of the bishop's high office. The irony of the cross, so sacred, so pure, now stained with blood, was not lost on Father Brown. "Was there a struggle?" Father Brown asked, his voice quiet as he leaned closer to examine the scene. "None," Sergeant Riley replied. He was alone. There's no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. We don't know how he was killed. No wounds, no marks. Father Brown's eyes narrowed as he studied the room. The desk was covered in documents, church records, personal, letters, a few unopened invitations. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary at first glance, but something was wrong. There was an unmistakable feeling of coldness in the room, a sense of finality that spoke of an unexpected death, one that had been carefully planned, not an act of passion. I need to speak with the servants, Father Brown said, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He turned to Perkins. Who discovered him? It was Martha, the housekeeper, Perkins said. She brought him his evening tea, as usual, and found him like this when she returned to collect the cup. Father Brown nodded, his mind sifting through the details. The lack of a struggle, the absence of an obvious weapon, the golden cross. In the bishop's hand, all of it was strange. This wasn't a random act. This was someone who knew the bishop well, someone who could get close to him without arousing suspicion. Bring me Martha, Father Brown said, and as the constable stepped out to fetch her, the priest stood quietly for a moment, his eyes still fixed on the body. His thoughts churned as he considered the implications. The bishop had been a man of power, a man who was known both for his charitable works and for his controversial decisions. He had wielded influence not only within the church, but also in the village. His death was bound to leave a void, but who would benefit from it? As he awaited the arrival of the housekeeper, Father Brown couldn't shake the feeling that this case was more than just a simple murder. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, and he was certain the answers would come from unexpected places. When Martha finally arrived, she was visibly shaken, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she recounted the details of her discovery. She described how she had entered the study to find the bishop in his chair, lifeless, the golden cross clutched in his hand, and the uneaten tea sitting cold on the side table. Nothing in her account raised any immediate alarms, but Father Brown's instincts told him that the truth of this murder was far more hidden than anyone could imagine. The mystery was just beginning, and as Father Brown stepped out of the study, he knew that the secrets of Bishop Westbrook's death were buried deep beneath the surface, and they would only be revealed through careful observation, quiet reflection, and the pursuit of a truth that many would prefer to keep hidden. The quiet hum of the small village was shattered as the news of Bishop Clarence Westbrook's death spread like wildfire through the town of Kettlebrook. Rumors whispered through the streets, from the corner bakery to the local pub, each retelling adding a layer of mystery and suspicion. Was it a natural death, a tragic accident, or something far darker, more sinister? Father Brown stood at the pulpit the morning after the bishop's death, his voice calm but heavy, reflecting the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. He had spent the night contemplating the scene at the bishop's residence, examining every possible angle of the murder in his mind. It was a case unlike any other he had faced. As he spoke to the congregation, his thoughts drifted to the many questions that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. The bishop had many friends and enemies, and Father Brown suspected that one of them held the key to the mystery. When the service ended, Father Brown left the church and walked towards the rectory where Sergeant Riley awaited him. The two men exchanged a brief nod as Father Brown approached. It was clear that Riley was eager for Father Brown's insight. The constable had been on edge since the moment he had been summoned to the bishop's residence, and the air between them was thick with the weight of uncertainty. "Father, I've gathered the usual suspects," Riley said, motioning toward the small group of individuals who had been close to the bishop. "They're waiting for you in the study." Father Brown nodded, but said nothing. His mind was already at work, sifting through the evidence he had so far. Martha, the housekeeper, had already been questioned, but she had provided little useful information. She had been in a state of shock, recounting the events mechanically, her hands trembling, as she had told her story. The servants in the bishop's household seemed equally distraught, but their faces betrayed a nervousness that suggested more than mere grief. As Father Brown entered the study, the group of suspects turned to face him. Among them were Miss Audrey Lambert, the bishop's personal assistant, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s with impeccable poise. Reverend Edward Hall, a younger priest who had often been at odds with the bishop on matters of church policy, and Sylvia Westbrook, the bishop's estranged sister, a woman whose bitterness towards the church was well known. Standing in the corner, a tall man with a dark expression, was Matthew Griffin, a local businessman whose financial dealings with the bishop had recently been a source of public tension. The morning after the first round of questioning, Father Brown found himself standing alone in the church, the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. The silence that enveloped him was soothing, but it also weighed heavily on his mind. The investigation into Bishop Clarence Westbrook's death was far from over, and the more he learned, the more certain he became that the answers lay hidden in the secrets of the church itself. Father Brown had spent years serving the people of Kettlebrook, guiding them through their faith and personal struggles. But the bishop, though a towering figure in the community, had often been a mysterious presence. His actions were known to be unconventional at times, and his position in the church was marked by a blend of power and privilege. Father Brown, though a man of strong faith, had never completely trusted the structure of the church, especially when it came to the inner workings of those at the top. The morning had already started with a visit to the local archives. There, Father Brown reviewed the bishop's past decisions. Documents, letters, and records detailed the bishop's impact on the church in the area. Some of it was public: his charitable acts, his speeches on morality and faith, his generosity toward the community. But there was something else lurking beneath the surface. His dealings with wealthy donors and the decisions he had made behind closed doors often raised eyebrows. It was clear that for someone so committed to faith, Bishop Westbrook had certain secrets that the public never got to see. Father Brown's investigation now led him to Reverend Edward Hall, the young priest who had been at odds with the bishop for some time. Reverend Hall had been outspoken about the bishop's refusal to modernize the church's approach to outreach and ministry. Though Hall had denied any involvement in the murder, Father Brown couldn't shake the feeling that Hall was hiding something, and so he decided to pay him a visit. Father Brown arrived at Hall's modest quarters in the church rectory just as the sun began to set. The rectory, nestled behind the main church building, was quiet, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Reverend Hall greeted Father Brown with a tight smile, his demeanor polite but distant. "Father Brown," Hall said, his voice as smooth as ever, "what brings you to my humble abode this evening?" Father Brown, ever the calm observer, stepped inside, glancing around the room. It was sparse but neat, nothing particularly revealing. The walls were adorned with a few religious icons and one or two personal photos, but there was nothing in the space that suggested Hall's deeper feelings on the matter. "I've been going through the bishop's records," Father Brown began, his eyes narrowing slightly as he chose his words carefully. "I've also been talking to some of the people who were closest to him. I can't help but notice a few inconsistencies. There are things I think you may be able to shed some light on." Reverend Hall's posture stiffened, his eyes flashing momentarily before he regained composure. "I've already told you everything I know, Father Brown. I don't have anything more to add. I have no idea who would want to kill Bishop Westbrook." Father Brown watched him for a long moment. "You don't think there's something unusual about the way the bishop ran the church? How he kept things to himself? Made decisions without consulting the others?" Reverend Hall's gaze flickered, but he kept his tone steady. "The bishop was a man of principle, Father Brown. He believed that as the bishop, he had the authority to make decisions on behalf of the church. I didn't always agree with him, but that's how the system works." Father Brown tilted his head, sensing that there was more to Hall's words than met the eye. Did the bishop have any enemies? People who were upset by his decisions? I'm sure, as someone who was close to him in the church, you might have seen some tension. Hall's face darkened, and for the first time, Father Brown saw a flicker of emotion that was impossible to ignore. The young priest shifted his weight nervously before speaking again, his voice quieter. It's true. There were some disagreements. People were not happy with the way the bishop handled certain things. But I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't think anyone would actually harm him. Father Brown's eyes sharpened, and he took a step closer, his voice steady but probing. You didn't think anyone would harm him. But you don't believe it's just a coincidence that the bishop's death has something to do with these disagreements? Hall hesitated for a moment, but then he spoke again, his voice strained. There were whispers, Father Brown. Whispers about the bishop's personal dealings with certain donors. People were starting to question where the money was really going. There were rumors of shady investments, financial arrangements that didn't sit well with some of the church members. I don't know the full truth, but I think those whispers may have reached the wrong ears. Father Brown was already making a mental note of Hall's words. The financial dealings of the bishop had been a point of contention, but now it seemed there was more to the story than he had first anticipated. If the bishop had been involved in questionable financial transactions, there were a number of people who could have felt betrayed, and some of them might have been desperate enough to act on their anger. Have you ever heard of a man named Matthew Griffin? Father Brown asked suddenly, his tone calm but direct. Hall's face tightened at the mention of the name, and for a brief second, Father Brown could see the younger priest's guard go up. Griffin? Yes, I know him. He's a businessman in the area, involved in some of the development projects around here. The bishop had a few dealings with him, but I don't trust Griffin. There's something off about him. I always thought he was too eager to align himself with the church. Father Brown nodded slowly, taking in the information. It was starting to make sense. Griffin's financial dealings with the bishop could have led to trouble. But trouble for whom? And was Griffin truly involved in the bishop's death? Or was he merely a pawn in a larger game? I'll need to speak with Mr. Griffin, Father Brown said, standing up. And there's one more thing, Reverend Hall. Your relationship with the bishop, was it entirely professional? Reverend Hall's eyes flashed with irritation. Of course, Father. We didn't always agree, but I had the utmost respect for him. Father Brown studied the priest carefully, the wheels in his mind turning, as he pieced together the puzzle. It was clear that Reverend Hall had something to hide, though whether it was connected to the bishop's murder remained to be seen. Before leaving the rectory, Father Brown took one last look at the young priest. I hope, Reverend, that when the truth comes out, we can all look back and know that it was the right thing for the church and for the soul of Kettlebrook. As Father Brown walked away from the rectory and into the night, he felt the weight of the case pressing on him. The more he uncovered, the more questions arose. The financial deals, the whispers, the hidden animosities, it all pointed to something much deeper than a simple murder. It was clear that the bishop's death was not just a tragedy. It was the unraveling of a long-kept secret, one that would take every ounce of Father Brown's intellect to uncover. And the deeper he delved into the mystery, the more certain he became that this case would reveal not just the murderer, but the dark underbelly of the church itself.